In the heart of Africa, where the Sahara Desert meets the fertile shores of Lake Chad, there existed a power so enduring, so resilient, that it outlasted empires, survived invasions, and adapted through centuries of transformation. While kingdoms rose and fell across continents, while dynasties crumbled under the weight of time and conquest, one African empire stood unshaken for over a millennium. This is the story of Kanem-Bornu, the 1,000-year dynasty that the world forgot, but history cannot erase. Before we journey into this epic tale of survival, power, and legacy, subscribe to this channel. Because the histories you were never taught, the stories deliberately left out of your textbooks, the empires that shaped civilizations but were erased from memory, they all live here. Hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about African history. The year is 700 CE. Europe is stumbling through its dark ages. The Islamic Golden Age is just beginning to illuminate the medieval world, and in the region surrounding Lake Chad, in what is now Chad, Nigeria, Niger, and Cameroon, something extraordinary is taking shape. The Kanem Empire is emerging from the confluence of nomadic Zagawa people and sedentary populations, creating a political entity that will defy every historical expectation, every pattern of imperial collapse, every prediction of inevitable decline. But this is not a story of accidental survival. This is not a tale of an empire that simply existed and endured through luck or isolation. No, this is the chronicle of a civilization that consciously, deliberately, strategically adapted to every threat, transformed with every challenge, and reinvented itself through every crisis. The empire of Kanem-Bornu did not just survive, it evolved, migrated, reformed, and persisted with a sophistication that modern historians are only beginning to understand. The origins of Kanem are shrouded in the mists of oral tradition and fragmentary written records. But what emerges from these sources is a picture of extraordinary political innovation. The Sahara Dynasty, which would rule this empire for over 1,000 years, claimed descent from Saif ibn Yazan, a legendary Yemeni hero. Whether this genealogy was historical fact or political mythology designed to establish legitimacy matters less than what it reveals. Even in its earliest formation, Kanem understood the power of narrative, the importance of connecting local authority to broader Islamic and trans-Saharan networks of prestige and power. The geography of Kanem was both its greatest advantage and its most persistent challenge. Lake Chad, once far larger than its current diminished size, provided water, fish, agricultural potential, and a hub for trade routes that stretched across the Sahara to North Africa and the Mediterranean beyond. The lake was life itself in a region where water meant survival, prosperity, and political control. But this same geography placed Kanem at the crossroads of competing peoples, rival polities, and the constant pressure of nomadic groups moving through the Sahel. The early Mays, the title for the rulers of Kanem, were not sedentary kings ruling from fixed palaces. They were mobile sovereigns, moving with their courts, their warriors, their administrators across territories that required constant presence, constant assertion of authority. This mobility was not a weakness. It was sophisticated statecraft adapted to the realities of Sahelian geography and politics. The Mai's presence was the state's presence. His tent was the palace. His entourage was the government. And this system, far from being primitive, allowed for flexible response to threats, efficient collection of tribute, and direct engagement with the diverse peoples under Kanem's expanding umbrella. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Kanem was consolidating its power through a combination of military conquest, strategic marriages, and the gradual adoption of Islam. The conversion of the Mays to Islam was not a sudden, complete transformation. It was a gradual process that began in the 11th century and accelerated under Humai, who is traditionally regarded as the first Muslim ruler of Kanem. This conversion was politically brilliant. It connected Kanem to the vast Islamic world, opening doors to trans-Saharan trade networks dominated by Muslim merchants, providing access to Islamic learning and literacy, and offering a universalist ideology that could help integrate the empire's diverse ethnic and linguistic groups. But make no mistake, the Islamization of Kanem was selective, adaptive, and pragmatic. The Mace retained many traditional prerogatives and practices. They did not simply import a foreign religion wholesale. They integrated Islamic legitimacy with indigenous sources of authority, creating a syncretic system that would prove remarkably resilient. The Mays balanced their identity as Muslim rulers with their role as traditional Sahelian sovereigns, navigating between Islamic scholars who demanded stricter adherence to Islamic law and traditional power holders who valued older customs and hierarchies. The 13th century marked Kanem's zenith under the extraordinary reign of Dunama-Dabalemi, who ruled from approximately 1210 to 1259. Dunama-Dabalemi expanded Kanem's territories dramatically, extending control far beyond the Lake Chad region into the Sahara itself, establishing tributary relationships with peoples as far north as the Fezzan in modern Libya. His reign represented the full flowering of Kanem's power, militarily dominant, economically prosperous through trans-Saharan trade, and diplomatically connected through embassies sent as far as Cairo and possibly Tunisia. Dunama-Dabalemi understood power in its full complexity. He was not merely a warrior king, though his military achievements were substantial. He was a state builder who reformed administration, a religious patron who established Quranic schools and supported Islamic learning, and a diplomat who understood that Kanem's position at the southern terminus of trans-Saharan trade routes gave it leverage in negotiations with North African powers. Under his rule, Kanem became a significant player in the broader Islamic world, known in Cairo, Tunis, and other centers of Islamic civilization as a powerful Sahelian empire. The economy of Kanem at its height was diverse and sophisticated. The empire controlled critical nodes in the trans-Saharan trade that connected West Africa to the Mediterranean world. Gold, ivory, and enslaved people moved northward through Kanem's territories. Salt, horses, weapons, luxury textiles, and manufactured goods moved southward. The Mays took their cut of this trade through customs, tribute, and direct trading operations conducted by the royal court. But the economy was not solely dependent on long-distance trade. Local production of grain, fish from Lake Chad, livestock raised by pastoral groups integrated into the empire's economy, all contributed to Kanem's prosperity and resilience. The military system of Kanem was equally sophisticated. The empire fielded cavalry forces that were legendary across the Sahel, horses imported from North Africa at great expense and bred locally where possible, gave Kanem military superiority over many neighboring peoples. The Kanem cavalry, armored in quilted protection, wielding spears and swords, became the empire's primary instrument of expansion and defense. But the military was not solely cavalry. Infantry, specialized forces including archers, and auxiliary troops from subject peoples all contributed to a military system that could project power across vast distances. Yet even at this zenith, even during Dunama-Dabalemi's reign when Kanem seemed invincible, the seeds of future crisis were being planted. The Mace's power depended on a delicate balance between different factions at court, between the royal lineage and powerful noble families, between centralized authority and the autonomy of regional powerholders. Dunama-Dabalemi, in his ambition and his reforms, disturbed some of these balances. His attempts to centralize power, to favor certain lineages over others, created resentments that would explode into civil conflict after his death. The 14th century brought the first great crisis that would test everything Kanem had built over 6 centuries. After Dynasty death, the empire descended into civil wars that modern historians call the Kanem Civil Wars, or the era of the Bulala conflicts. The Bulala people, who had been subjects or neighbors of Kanem, rose in rebellion, backed by dissident factions within the Kanem elite itself. This was not a simple external invasion. This was a combination of internal political fragmentation and external pressure that threatened to destroy the empire entirely. The violence was devastating. The civil wars raged for decades. Mays were deposed, assassinated, replaced in rapid succession as different factions fought for control. The central authority that had held Kanem together fragmented. Tributary states broke away, recognizing that the Mays' power to enforce submission had weakened. Trade routes became dangerous as political stability collapsed. The carefully constructed edifice of Kanem power seemed to be crumbling, following the familiar historical pattern of imperial decline: expansion, zenith, overextension, civil war, collapse. But Kanem did not follow that pattern to its conclusion. And here, in this moment of existential crisis, we see the first great demonstration of the adaptability that would define this empire's millennium of survival. Unable to defeat the Bulala and their allies, unable to restore control over the original Kanem heartland east of Lake Chad, the Sahara Dynasty made a decision that was both desperate and brilliant. They migrated. They moved the center of their power westward across Lake Chad into the region known as Bornu. This was not a retreat. This was not an admission of defeat, though it must have felt like catastrophe to those who experienced it. This was a strategic relocation, a conscious decision to abandon territory that could not be held and to rebuild power in a region where it could be reconstituted. The migration to Bornu in the late 14th century was one of the most significant moments in African political history, though it is barely mentioned in world history texts. An entire imperial structure, the dynasty, the court, the administrative apparatus, the military leadership, picked up and moved, maintaining continuity of rulership and identity while transforming the geographical and political basis of their power. In Bornu, west of Lake Chad, the Sahara Mays found new opportunities. The region had agricultural potential, particularly in the areas away from the desert margins. Local populations, including Kanuri-speaking peoples who would give their name to the empire's dominant ethnic identity, were integrated into the new political structure. The Mays rebuilt their state, slowly, patiently, learning from the disasters that had driven them from Kanem. They created a more decentralized administrative system, one that gave more autonomy to regional governors while maintaining ultimate authority in the Mays' hands. They rebuilt their military, recruiting from new populations and adapting their tactics. The 15th century was a period of reconstruction and consolidation. The Mays of this era were not trying to match the expansive glory of Dynasty. They were focused on survival, on building stable foundations for renewed power. They maintained the fiction, or the aspiration, that they were still rulers of Kanem, even as the Bulala controlled those territories. This maintenance of the Kanem identity was crucial. The empire became known as Kanem-Bornu, a name that asserted continuity with the past while acknowledging the present. Reality. This was political genius, admitting transformation while claiming unbroken legitimacy. By the late 15th century, Bornu was stable enough to begin expanding again. The Mays pushed their authority outward from their core territories, subduing neighboring peoples, re-establishing control over trade routes, and rebuilding the military capacity that had been Kanem's foundation. But the world around them was changing in ways that would present entirely new challenges. The trans-Saharan trade networks that had been relatively stable for centuries were being affected by changes in North Africa and the Mediterranean. The Portuguese had established themselves on the West African coast, creating new trade routes that bypassed the Sahara. The political landscape of the Sahel was becoming more complex, with new centers of power emerging. Then came the crisis that would have destroyed a lesser state, the challenge that would call forth the greatest ruler in Kanem-Bornu's 1,000-year history. In the early 16th century, Bornu faced a multifaceted threat. The Bulala, still controlling old Kanem territories, remained hostile. New enemies emerged from the Hausa states to the west. Pastoral groups raided the empire's borders. The administrative system was showing strains. The military had grown complacent. The empire that had survived migration and rebuilt itself in Bornu seemed, once again, on the edge of decline. In 1564, Idris Aluma ascended to the throne, and with his reign, Kanem-Bornu would experience a renaissance that would secure its power for centuries to come. Idris Aluma was a military genius, an administrative reformer, a diplomatic innovator, and a religious patron whose achievements would be recorded by his court chronicler, Ibn Fatuwa, giving us one of the most detailed accounts we have of any pre-colonial African ruler. Idris Aluma's reign was transformative in ways that reached into every aspect of Bornu's existence. His military reforms began with a recognition that Bornu's traditional cavalry forces, while still potent, were no longer sufficient. Idris Aluma did something revolutionary. He imported firearms from North Africa and the Ottoman Empire, trained specialized units in their use, and integrated gunpowder weapons into Bornu's military system. He was among the first Sahelian rulers to do this systematically. The result was a military force that combined the shock power of cavalry, the tactical flexibility of infantry, and the devastating impact of muskets. This reformed military became the instrument of a series of campaigns that expanded Bornu's territory, secured its borders, and crushed its enemies. Idris Aluma campaigned constantly throughout his 30-plus-year reign. He led expeditions against the Bulala, finally reconquering parts of old Kanem and avenging the humiliations of the 14th century. He subdued rebellious territories within Bornu itself. He launched punitive expeditions against raiding groups. He campaigned in the Hausa states, imposing Bornu's overlordship or extracting tribute. His military success was not just about battlefield victories. It was about demonstrating Bornu's power so convincingly that potential enemies chose submission over resistance. But Idris Aluma understood that military power alone was insufficient. He reformed Bornu's administration, creating a more efficient system for collecting tribute, administering justice, and integrating conquered territories. He established a more regular system of provincial governance, appointing governors who were accountable to the central court, but who had sufficient autonomy to respond to local conditions. He reformed the legal system, bringing it more in line with Islamic law while maintaining flexibility for local customs. He established a more professional bureaucracy, creating administrative positions staffed by educated individuals rather than relying solely on hereditary nobility. His religious policies were equally significant. Idris Aluma was a pious Muslim who undertook the Hajj to Mecca, establishing diplomatic and religious connections across the Islamic world. He returned from pilgrimage with scholars, books, and ideas. He built mosques and Islamic schools throughout Bornu. He promoted a more orthodox form of Islam, though pragmatically, always balancing Islamic ideals with political realities. His support for Islamic learning made Bornu a center of scholarship in the Sahel, attracting students and scholars from across West Africa. Diplomatically, Idris Aluma was a sophisticated operator. He maintained relations with the Ottoman Empire, the major Islamic power of his era, receiving recognition and support from Istanbul. He sent embassies to Morocco and Egypt. He corresponded with other Sahelian rulers. He understood that Bornu's security and prosperity depended not just on military strength, but on being embedded in broader networks of trade, diplomacy, and Islamic civilization. Under his rule, Bornu was not an isolated African kingdom. It was a recognized power in the Islamic world, known and respected from Istanbul to Cairo to Timbuktu. The economy flourished under Idris Aluma's stable rule. Trans-Saharan trade expanded as security improved along the trade routes. Bornu's markets became prosperous centers where North African merchants met West African traders. The capital, Ngazargamu, which had been founded in the 15th century, grew into a significant city with impressive architecture, bustling markets, and a cosmopolitan population that included merchants and scholars from across the Islamic world. The production of local goods, textiles, leather goods, metalwork, increased to meet both local demand and export opportunities. Idris Aluma's reign ended around 1596 or 1603. The exact date is uncertain, but his legacy was profound and lasting. He had taken an empire that was showing signs of weakness and transformed it into the most powerful state in the central Sahel. He had modernized its military, reformed its administration, strengthened its Islamic identity, and expanded its territory. Most importantly, he had secured its survival for another 2 centuries. Kanem-Bornu, after Idris Aluma, was not the largest African empire. That distinction belonged to Songhai until its fall, and later to others. But it was among the most stable, most resilient, most adaptable. The 17th and 18th centuries saw Kanem-Bornu maintain its position as a major regional power, though not without challenges. The trans-Saharan trade networks that had been the economic foundation of Sahelian empires were gradually declining in relative importance as European maritime trade around the African coast grew. The political landscape of West Africa was changing with the rise of new powers and the increasing impact of the Atlantic slave trade, which created different economic incentives and political dynamics than the trans-Saharan slave trade that Bornu had participated in for centuries. Yet Kanem-Bornu adapted, as it always had. When trans-Saharan trade declined, the empire focused more on regional trade networks, on agricultural production, on maintaining its position through military power and political prestige, rather than solely through control of long-distance trade. The Mayais continued to rule from Ngazargamu, maintaining the elaborate court ceremonies, the complex administrative system, and the military traditions that Idris Aluma had strengthened. Succession was not always smooth. Internal conflicts over the throne continued to occur, but the Sahara dynasty maintained its legitimacy and its control. The empire's population was diverse, reflecting centuries of expansion, migration, and integration. The Kanuri became the dominant ethnic group, and Kanem-Bornu is sometimes simply called the Kanuri Empire in historical literature. But Kanuri identity itself was complex, incorporating people of diverse origins who had been integrated into the empire's political and cultural framework. Arabs, Tuareg, Hausa, Shuar Arabs, and numerous other groups lived within the empire, some fully integrated, others maintaining distinct identities while accepting Bornu's political authority. The social structure was hierarchical but with avenues for mobility. At the top was the Mai, the sovereign whose person embodied the state's continuity and legitimacy. Below him was the court aristocracy, noble families who held high offices and controlled significant resources. Then came provincial governors, military commanders, and local chiefs who administered territories and maintained order. Below them were free commoners, farmers, pastoralists, artisans, merchants, who formed the productive foundation of the economy. And at the bottom were enslaved people, captured in warfare or born into servitude, who worked in agriculture, households, and the military. The institution of slavery in Kanem-Bornu, like elsewhere in the pre-colonial Islamic world, was complex and variable. Some enslaved people held positions of significant responsibility: military commanders, court officials, governors of provinces. Others worked in harsh conditions on agricultural estates or as domestic servants. The empire's participation in the slave trade, both trans-Saharan and later Atlantic, was a significant but troubling aspect of its economy and its power. It is impossible to celebrate Kanem-Bornu's achievements without acknowledging this dimension of its existence, this participation in systems of human exploitation that funded much of the trans-Saharan trade that enriched the empire. The cultural achievements of Kanem-Bornu deserve recognition alongside its political and military accomplishments. The empire was a center of Islamic learning, with schools and scholarly traditions that produced religious texts, historical chronicles, and legal commentaries. The architectural heritage, while much of it has not survived to the present, included impressive buildings constructed in the Sahelian style, earthen architecture that was both functional in the climate and aesthetically sophisticated. The oral traditions of the Kanuri people, including epic poetry, historical narratives, and moral teachings, were extensive and complex, transmitted through generations of griots and storytellers. The empire's resilience was tested again in the late 18th century when a new crisis emerged. The Sahara Dynasty, after ruling for over 1,000 years, began to weaken. The mechanisms of succession became sites of intense conflict. Different factions backed different candidates. Provincial governors grew increasingly autonomous. Military effectiveness declined as the empire's resources were consumed in internal conflicts. External enemies sensed weakness and began testing Bornu's borders. By the early 19th century, Kanem-Bornu was in serious decline. The Mays had become relatively weak figures, dominated by powerful court factions. The empire's military was no longer the formidable force it had been under Idris Aluma. Provincial control was fragmenting. And then came the challenge that would finally end the Sahara dynasty but would also, paradoxically, save the empire itself from complete collapse: the Jihad of Usman Dan Fodio and the expansion of the Sokoto Caliphate. Usman Dan Fodio launched his jihad in 1804 in the Hausa states to the west of Bornu, calling for Islamic reform and the overthrow of corrupt rulers. The jihad succeeded spectacularly, creating the Sokoto Caliphate, which rapidly became the largest state in West Africa. Inevitably, the Sokoto forces turned their attention eastward, toward Bornu. Jihadist armies invaded, arguing that Bornu's Islam was corrupt and that its rulers had fallen away from true Islamic practice. Bornu's weakened forces could not effectively resist. The Sokoto armies overran much of the empire. The capital, Ngazagamu, fell. The last Sahara Mai fled into exile. After more than a millennium, the Sahara dynasty had fallen. The 1,000-year empire seemed to have finally reached its end. But once again, Kanem-Bornu defied historical expectations. From this disaster emerged one of the most remarkable figures in African history, Muhammad al-Kanemi. Al-Kanemi was an Islamic scholar of mixed Arab and Kanuri ancestry who had been in Bornu during the Sokoto invasion. As the Sahara state collapsed, al-Kanemi organized resistance. He was not a member of the royal family. He had no hereditary claim to rule. But he had religious legitimacy as a learned scholar, military ability as an effective commander, and political skill as someone who could rally diverse groups to a common cause. Al-Kanemi challenged the religious justifications for the Sokoto Jihad against Bornu. He wrote letters to the leaders of Sokoto, engaging in sophisticated theological debate, arguing that Bornu had been Muslim for centuries and that the jihad against it was unjustified by Islamic law. These letters, which survive, show a mind of remarkable sophistication and learning. But al-Kanemi did not rely solely on argument. He organized military resistance, forming an army from the remnants of Bornu's forces and from groups loyal to him personally. He defeated Sokoto armies in a series of battles, gradually pushing them back out of Bornu's core territories. By 1810, Al-Kanemi had effectively saved Bornu from conquest. He had restored stability, re-established control over the core territories around Lake Chad, and created a new political order. But he faced a dilemma. He was not of royal blood. The Sahara dynasty, despite its collapse, still held immense symbolic legitimacy. Al-Kanemi's solution was politically brilliant and historically unique. He restored a Sahara Mai to the throne, presenting himself as merely the Mai's servant and military commander. But everyone understood the reality. Al-Kanemi held the actual power, while the Mai provided legitimacy and continuity. This arrangement, a figurehead Sahara Mai and Al-Kanemi as the real ruler, persisted until Al-Kanemi's death in 1837. During these decades, Al-Kanemi rebuilt Bornu's power. He established a new capital at Kukawa, which would serve as the center of the state for the rest of the 19th century. He reformed the administration, creating a system that was more centralized and efficient than the late Sahara state had been. He maintained and expanded Bornu's military, ensuring that it could defend against both the Sokoto Caliphate to the west and various other threats. He promoted trade and economic recovery. He was a patron of Islamic learning, building on Bornu's long tradition of scholarship. When Al-Kanemi died, his son Omar succeeded to his father's position of power, and here the fiction of Sahara rule finally ended. Omar eventually dispensed with the figurehead Mai entirely, establishing his own dynasty, the Shehu dynasty, taking the title Shehu from his father's religious title of Sheikh. The Sahara dynasty, after over 1,000 years, was truly finished. But the state itself, the empire of Kanem-Bornu, survived. Under the Shehu dynasty, Bornu would continue for another half-century as a significant regional power, maintaining its identity, its administrative traditions, and its position in the political landscape of the Central Sahel. The mid-19th century brought new challenges from unexpected directions. European explorers began penetrating into the African interior, mapping territories, gathering information, and preparing the way for colonial conquest. The first European known to have visited Bornu was Dixon Denham in 1823, followed by other explorers including Heinrich Barth in the 1850s. These explorers left detailed accounts of Bornu, its government, its economy, its society, its military. Barth in particular provided an invaluable record of Bornu at its height under Shehu Omar, describing an empire that was still prosperous, well-organized and powerful. But the European presence in Africa was accelerating toward the colonial conquest that would transform the entire continent. In the 1880s and 1890s, European powers carved Africa into colonial territories through arbitrary diplomatic agreements like the Berlin Conference. The region around Lake Chad became a zone of competition between the British, French, and Germans, each colonial power seeking to control territories and establish spheres of influence. Bornu attempted to navigate this new reality, maintaining its independence and autonomy through diplomatic engagement with the European powers. The Shehus understood that direct military confrontation with European colonial forces, with their modern weapons and resources, was likely futile. They sought treaties, agreements, and accommodations that might preserve some form of autonomy, but the logic of colonialism was totalizing. The Europeans wanted complete control, not negotiated relationships with independent African states. In the 1890s, a new threat emerged from the east. Rabi az-Zubair, a Sudanese warlord who had built a military state through conquest and the slave trade. Rabi invaded Bornu in 1893, defeating the Shehu's forces and conquering much of the empire. Shehu was killed. Rabi established himself as the new ruler, bringing Bornu under his control. This seemed to be the final end of Kanem-Bornu's independent existence, conquered not by Europeans but by another African warlord whose empire was itself soon to be crushed by colonialism. Rabi's rule over Bornu lasted only 7 years. In 1900, French colonial forces invaded from the west as part of their effort to establish control over the Lake Chad region. Rabi resisted, but his forces were defeated by the superior French firepower. Rabi himself was killed in battle, and with his death, the last independent polity claiming the heritage of Kanem-Bornu ceased to exist as a sovereign state. The French, British, and Germans partitioned the region, drawing colonial boundaries that divided the former empire's territories between French Equatorial Africa, British Northern Nigeria, and German Cameroon. The colonial partition of Kanem-Bornu's territories was an act of historical violence. Borders drawn in European capitals divided peoples who had been united under Bornu's authority for centuries. The Kanuri found themselves separated by colonial boundaries, their political and cultural unity fractured by arbitrary lines on maps made by foreign powers who knew nothing and cared nothing about local histories, identities, and relationships. The administrative systems, the trade networks, the social structures that had developed over a millennium under Kanem-Bornu were disrupted and replaced with colonial bureaucracies designed to extract resources and maintain control. Under colonial rule, the memory of Kanem-Bornu was marginalized and distorted. European colonial administrators and historians portrayed pre-colonial African states as primitive, unstable, and inconsequential. The extraordinary achievement of an empire that had survived and adapted for over 1,000 years was dismissed or ignored. The sophisticated administrative systems, the military innovations, the diplomatic engagements, the cultural and intellectual achievements, all were buried under narratives of African backwardness that justified colonial domination. Yet the legacy of Kanem-Bornu survived among the Kanuri people and in the broader historical consciousness of the Lake Chad region. Oral traditions preserved memories of great mayais, of military victories, of the migration from Kanem to Bornu, of Idris Aluma's reforms, of Al-Kanemi's resistance. The Shehu dynasty, though stripped of political power, maintained some ceremonial authority under British indirect rule in what became northern Nigeria. The cultural practices, the language, the social structures that had developed under Kanem-Bornu continued, adapted to colonial and post-colonial contexts. When the colonial empires themselves finally fell in the mid-20th century, the territories that had been part of Kanem-Bornu became parts of newly independent African nations: Chad, Niger, Nigeria, Cameroon. These modern nation-states bore the marks of colonial partition rather than reflecting pre-colonial political geographies. The Kanuri people, the inheritors of Kanem-Bornu's legacy, found themselves divided among these new nations, often marginalized within political systems dominated by other ethnic groups or regions. In northeastern Nigeria, which encompasses much of what was Bornu, the Shehu of Bornu maintains a traditional title with cultural and religious significance, but no political power in the modern state. The Shehudom represents a living link to the empire's past, a reminder that the history of this region extends far beyond colonialism and the modern Nigerian state. The current Shehu presides over ceremonies, mediates disputes, and serves as a cultural figurehead for the Kanuri people, embodying a continuity that reaches back through centuries. The history of Kanem-Bornu challenges fundamental narratives about Africa, about empires, about state formation and political development. In Western historical consciousness, African states before European colonialism are often portrayed as brief, fragile, and peripheral. The great civilizations of human history are assumed to be elsewhere, in Europe, Asia, the Middle East. African states in this distorted narrative were minor actors at best, irrelevant to the main currents of world history. Kanem-Bornu demolishes these assumptions. Here was an empire that lasted longer than most European states, that successfully navigated challenges that destroyed other empires, that adapted and transformed while maintaining institutional and dynastic continuity. When the Roman Empire fell, it did not migrate and reconstitute itself elsewhere. When the Abbasid Caliphate collapsed, it did not transform into a new political formation under the same dynasty. Yet Kanem-Bornu did exactly this, demonstrating a resilience and adaptability that few political systems in human history have matched. The empire's survival was not accidental, it was the result of deliberate choices, sophisticated political thinking, and flexible institutions. When civil war threatened to destroy Kanem in the 14th century, the Sahara Dynasty chose migration over destruction, strategic retreat over futile last stands. When the empire needed reform in the 16th century, Idris Aluma provided it, transforming military, administrative, and religious institutions while maintaining continuity with the past. When the Sahara Dynasty finally collapsed in the 19th century, Al-Kanemi created a new political arrangement that saved the state even as it ended the ancient royal line. These moments of crisis and transformation reveal political sophistication that should fundamentally change how we understand African history and statecraft. Kanem-Bornu's leaders understood that survival required flexibility, that institutional continuity was more important than territorial fixity, that legitimacy could be maintained even through profound transformations. These insights were not theoretical abstractions, they were practical wisdom forged through centuries of experience governing in the challenging environment of the Sahel. The empire's economic foundations also demonstrate sophistication. Kanem-Bornu did not depend on a single source of wealth. It diversified its economy across trans-Saharan trade, regional trade networks, agricultural production, livestock raising, and military extraction through conquest and tribute. When trans-Saharan trade declined in the 18th century, the empire adjusted, focusing more on regional trade and agricultural production. This economic flexibility contributed to the empire's longevity, preventing the kind of economic collapse that often accompanies shifts in trade routes and patterns. The military innovations of Kanem-Bornu, particularly under Idris Aluma, also deserve emphasis. The adoption of firearms in the 16th century was technologically sophisticated and strategically brilliant. Idris Aluma did not simply acquire guns as exotic prestige items. He systematically integrated them into military doctrine, trained specialized units, and transformed Bornu's military effectiveness. This adaptation to new military technology contrasts sharply with stereotypes of African societies as technologically stagnant or resistant to innovation. The religious and cultural dimensions of Kanem-Bornu's history reveal complexities that challenge simplistic narratives about Islamization in Africa. The empire's adoption of Islam was gradual, selective, and pragmatic. The Mays were Muslim rulers who also maintained pre-Islamic traditions and authorities. They balanced Islamic scholars' demands for orthodox practice with political realities requiring flexibility and accommodation. This balancing act was not hypocrisy or incomplete conversion. It was sophisticated political and religious synthesis, creating a form of Islam that was authentically both Islamic and African. The intellectual and scholarly traditions of Kanem-Bornu are less well documented than we might wish, but the evidence we have suggests a rich cultural life. The empire produced historical chronicles, religious texts, and legal commentaries. It attracted scholars from across the Islamic world. Its centers of learning contributed to the broader intellectual life of West African Islam. The correspondence between Al-Kanemi and the leaders of Sokoto demonstrates high-level theological sophistication. These achievements place Kanem-Bornu firmly within the Islamic Golden Age's broader tradition of learning and scholarship, challenging narratives that locate Islamic intellectual life solely in the Middle East and North Africa. The tragedy of Kanem-Bornu's legacy is how thoroughly it has been erased from popular historical consciousness. While European empires like Rome or medieval kingdoms like France feature prominently in world history curricula, while Asian empires like Ming China or the Mughals are at least mentioned, African empires like Kanem-Bornu are routinely omitted. This erasure is not accidental. It reflects deliberate choices in how history has been taught, shaped by colonial ideologies that portrayed Africa as a continent without history, without civilization, without significant political achievements. The archaeological and historical work needed to fully recover Kanem-Bornu's history remains incomplete. Many sites associated with the empire have not been systematically excavated. Many written sources remain untranslated or unanalyzed. Much of what we know comes from external sources, North African chronicles, European explorers' accounts, rather than from the extensive internal documentation that the empire surely produced, but which has largely been lost or remains inaccessible. As African history gains more attention and resources, as more scholars dedicate themselves to recovering this past, our understanding of Kanem-Bornu will deepen and become more nuanced. For the Kanuri people today, Kanem-Bornu is not a dead history. It is living memory, part of contemporary identity. The stories of the Mayais, of the empire's migrations and transformations, of its resistance to enemies and adaptation to challenges. These narratives continue to shape Kanuri consciousness and pride. In a world where African identities are often defined through the trauma of colonialism and slavery, Kanem-Bornu offers a different narrative, one of power, sophistication, and resilience that predates and exceeds the colonial era. The empire's legacy also exists in the political and social structures of the Lake Chad region. Patterns of governance, social organization, trade networks, and cultural practices that developed under Kanem-Bornu continue to influence the region, often in ways not immediately visible but deeply embedded in how societies function. The emphasis on centralized yet flexible authority, the integration of diverse ethnic groups under broad political umbrellas, the importance of Islamic scholarship and authority, all these features of contemporary Sahelian societies have roots in the centuries of Kanem-Bornu's dominance. In recent decades, the Lake Chad region has faced profound challenges: environmental degradation as the lake shrinks, political instability and conflict, economic marginalization, and the rise of extremist groups like Boko Haram that have brought devastating violence to northeastern Nigeria and surrounding areas. These contemporary crises have overshadowed the region's historical significance, reducing it in global consciousness to a zone of poverty, violence, and disaster. Yet understanding the history of Kanem-Bornu should fundamentally change how we view this region. This was once the center of a great civilization, a hub of trade and learning, a place of political sophistication and cultural achievement. The challenges the region faces today are not the result of inherent backwardness or the failure of African peoples. They are the consequences of colonial disruption, post-colonial misgovernance, environmental change, and global economic marginalization, all factors external to the historical trajectory that Kanem-Bornu represented. Recovering and celebrating the history of Kanem-Bornu is not merely an academic exercise, it is an act of historical justice, a reclamation of African agency and achievement. It counters narratives of African inferiority and incompetence. It demonstrates that Africans built complex, sophisticated, enduring political systems long before European contact, that African societies were not waiting for external civilization, but were creating their own civilizations with their own logic and genius. For those of us seeking to understand human political history in its full diversity, Kanem-Bornu offers crucial lessons. It demonstrates that there is no single path of political development, no universal model that all societies must follow. The empire's combination of mobility and stability, its balance between Islamic universalism and local particularism, its ability to transform while maintaining continuity, these represent distinctly African solutions to universal political challenges. They expand our understanding of what is possible in political organization and state formation. The 1,000-year history of Kanem-Bornu is a testament to human resilience and adaptability. In a region of geographic challenges, climatic variability, and complex ethnic and political dynamics, a single dynasty and the state it created persisted longer than almost any comparable political entity in human history. This persistence was not mere survival, it was an active, creative adaptation, a constant process of transformation that maintained core identities and institutions while changing almost everything else. As we face our own era of rapid change, of political instability, of challenges that seem to threaten the foundations of our societies, there is wisdom to be found in Kanem-Bornu's example. The empire survived not through rigidity, but through flexibility. It maintained continuity not by refusing to change, but by changing strategically and deliberately. It preserved its identity not by isolation, but by engagement with broader networks and forces. These lessons, forged in the Sahel over a millennium, remain relevant as we navigate our own uncertain futures. The empire of Kanem-Bornu was not perfect. It participated in slavery and the slave trade. It waged wars of conquest and imposed its will on subject peoples. Its history includes violence, oppression, and exploitation, alongside its achievements. Acknowledging this complexity is essential. We do not serve historical truth by replacing European-centered mythology with African-centered hagiography. The goal is not to claim that Kanem-Bornu was uniquely virtuous, but to recognize that it was comparable to other pre-modern empires, with similar combinations of achievement and brutality, sophistication and violence. What sets Kanem-Bornu apart is not moral superiority, but temporal endurance and adaptive capacity. While other empires rose and fell, dynasties came and went, while states fragmented and reformed, Kanem-Bornu persisted. The Sahara Dynasty ruled for over 1,000 years. Even when that dynasty finally fell, the state itself survived under new leadership. This is an extraordinary achievement that demands recognition and study. In the end, the story of Kanem-Bornu is a story about time, about the long arc of history, about how human institutions and identities persist across centuries, about what it takes for a political system to survive not just decades or generations, but entire epochs. It is a story that has been buried and forgotten, erased from the historical consciousness of much of the world, but it is a story that refuses to remain buried, that breaks through the imposed silences, that demands to be heard and remembered. The 1,000-year empire that survived. Everything, civil wars and invasions, droughts and famines, dynastic crises and revolutionary transformations, and finally colonial conquest, has left its mark on the Lake Chad region, on African history, and on human history more broadly. That mark is deep and indelible, even when it has been ignored or denied. As we work to decolonize our understanding of the past, to center African experiences and achievements in world history, Kanem-Bornu stands as one of the most powerful examples of what African peoples achieved, how African states functioned, and why African history matters not just to Africans, but to anyone seeking to understand the full scope of human political and social development. The Mays of Kanem, the Shehus of Bornu, the warriors and administrators and scholars who built and sustained this empire across centuries, they deserve to be remembered alongside the Caesars and caliphs, the Khans and kings who dominate historical memory. Their achievement was no less significant, their political sophistication no less impressive, their legacy no less important. The empire of Kanem-Bornu survived everything history threw at it for 1,000 years. That survival, that resilience, that adaptive genius. This is the story that needed to be told, the history that needed to be reclaimed, the legacy that continues to echo through time, waiting for those willing to listen and to remember.